There is a clay prism in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, England. It stands roughly 20 centimeters tall, four-sided, inscribed in Sumerian cuneiform on every face. It was excavated at Larak in southern Iraq in the early 1920s and catalogued at the Ashmolean shortly after. The prism contains the oldest known list of kings who ruled the cities of ancient Sumer. It begins not with a man, not with a dynasty, not even with a date, but with a single declarative line that has never been satisfactorily explained by mainstream Assyriology. The line reads, "When kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was an Eridu. The first ruler it names is Alulim. His reign, according to the prism, lasted 28,800 years. The second ruler, Alalgar, reigned for 36,000 years. And then the kingship moved, not through conquest, not through inheritance, but through what the text describes as a deliberate transfer, to the city of Bad-tibira, then to Larak, then to Sippar, then to Shuruppak. 5 cities, 8 rulers, a combined total of 241,200 years. And then the flood came. It is called the Weld-Blundell prism after its original collector, and the question that sits inside it, the one that no major Assyriological journal has answered in full, is not whether the numbers are real. It is why these 5 cities, in this specific order, with this specific duration scheme, were written down at all. The prism is one of over a dozen known copies of what scholars call the Sumerian king list. The physical object dates to approximately 1900 BCE, but the textual tradition it preserves is older, substantially older. The script is Sumerian cuneiform, the language is Sumerian, and the list is organized not chronologically in the way a modern historian would recognize, but geographically by city. Kingship does not progress forward in time. It moves from place to place. It descends. It transfers. It comes down from heaven to a city, remains there for a calculated period, and then moves to the next. The text treats this movement as a mechanism, not a metaphor. There is no ambiguity in the Sumerian phrasing. The verb used, the descend, is the same verb used elsewhere in Sumerian administrative texts for the physical movement of goods, personnel, and authority from one location to another. The conventional reading holds that the antediluvian section is mythological preamble, a legitimating device used by later Sumerian scribes to anchor their dynastic claims in deep time. But the thesis of this video is different. Zechariah Sitchin, in The 12th Planet, published in 1976, argued that these 5 cities were not symbolic. They were not scribal inventions. They were operational centers, built, administered, and eventually abandoned by the Anunnaki, and the impossibly long reign durations were not metaphors for prestige. They were records of rotation cycles, administrative tenures measured in units the scribes themselves defined. The names are real. The cities are real. 4 of the 5 have been excavated, and the order in which kingship moved between them, Sitchin argued, corresponds to a functional infrastructure, from initial settlement to metallurgy, to territorial administration, to astronomical observation, to flood preparation. That reading has been published. It has been translated into over 25 languages, and it has not been refuted in any peer-reviewed Assyriological journal. The specific structural argument that the 5 cities form a functional sequence whose archaeological profiles match the roles the text implies has never been addressed in print by any credentialed Assyriologist. If you find that the academic literature on artifacts like these has been incomplete, if you suspect there are records sitting in museums that have never been read as anything other than mythology, this channel exists for that work. Subscribe only if that is the question you have been looking for. The rest of us continue. The conventional reading of the Sumerian king list is well established and has been the standard in Near Eastern studies for nearly a century. Samuel Noah Kramer, widely regarded as the foremost Sumerologist of the 20th century, treated the antediluvian section as a literary topos, a traditional preamble that served political functions for later dynasties. In his 1963 work, The Sumerians, Kramer described the pre-flood kings as part of a mythological framework that gave subsequent rulers a claim to divine continuity. Kramer's authority in this field was enormous. He had spent decades at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, personally translating and cataloging hundreds of Sumerian literary tablets. His judgments carried the weight of direct contact with the primary sources in a way that few scholars of his generation could match. And his judgment on the antediluvian section was clear. It was not history. It was ideology dressed in the language of deep time. Thorkild Jacobsen, who published the critical edition of the Sumerian King List in 1939 under the title The Sumerian King List, was more specific in his analysis. Jacobsen argued that the antediluvian section was a late addition, probably appended during the Isin dynasty, roughly 1800 BCE, to legitimize Isin's claim to hegemony over all of Sumer by linking their kingship back through Shuruppak and ultimately to Eridu. In this reading, the enormous reign lengths are symbolic of divine favor. The sequence of cities is a political genealogy, not a geographic itinerary. The named rulers are fictional anchors, not historical figures. And the phrase, kingship descended from heaven, is a theological statement. The Sumerians believed that political authority was a gift from the gods, periodically redistributed among cities according to divine will. Jacobsen supported this interpretation by noting that the historical sections of the king list, the post-flood dynasties, could be correlated with other independent records, including year names, royal inscriptions, and administrative archives. The antediluvian section could not be correlated with anything. It stood alone, unsupported by any independent textual witness, and therefore, Jacobsen concluded, it should be treated as literary composition rather than historical record. A. Leo Oppenheim, in Ancient Mesopotamia, published in 1964, reinforced this interpretation from a different angle. Oppenheim was less interested in the literary function of the king list and more interested in its political utility. The king list, Oppenheim argued, was a tool of statecraft. Its purpose was not to record history, but to assert legitimacy. Every dynasty that appeared in the list was presented as having received kingship through divine transfer, the same mechanism described in the antediluvian section. The antediluvian preamble, in Oppenheim's view, established the theological principle that the historical sections then applied to real dynasties. It was a foundation myth for the institution of kingship itself, not a record of specific events. Stephanie Dalley, the Oxford Assyriologist, who produced one of the most widely used translations of Mesopotamian literary texts in her 1989 volume, Myths from Mesopotamia, similarly treated the pre-flood rulers as symbolic. In her notes accompanying the translation, Dalley acknowledged the mathematical structure of the reign length. She noted that they are all expressible as multiples of the Sar, the Sumerian unit of 3,600, but interpreted this as a reflection of the Sumerian sexagesimal system applied to mythological time. The scribes, Dalley suggested, were using familiar mathematical units to express the idea that divine kingship existed from the very beginning, without making a literal chronological claim. The numbers were not random, but they were not historical either. They were mathematical expressions of theological duration. This is the standard view. It appears in every major textbook on Mesopotamian civilization published in the last 50 years. It has been taught in every major Near Eastern studies department from Chicago to London to Paris to Berlin. And it leaves several questions conspicuously unanswered. The first question the conventional reading does not answer is geographic. Eridu, Bad-tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak are real places. They are not literary inventions. They have been excavated, they have stratigraphy, they have radiocarbon dates, and their positions relative to one another in the alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia are not random. If the antediluvian section were purely a political legitimation device, a scribal invention designed to anchor the Isin dynasty's claims, why would the scribes choose these 5 specific cities rather than, say, Uruk, Lagash, or Nippur, which were far more politically significant in the period when the king list was compiled? Nippur, in particular, was the religious center of Sumer, the seat of Enlil, the chief of the Sumerian pantheon. If the purpose of the antediluvian section was to assert theological legitimacy, Nippur's absence from the list is difficult to explain. Instead, the list names 5 cities that share a different kind of significance, not political prestige, but functional specificity. Eridu, modern Tel Abu Shahrain in southern Iraq, is the oldest continuously occupied city in Mesopotamia. That is not a contested claim. It is the consensus of every major archaeological survey of the region. Excavations led by Fuad Sippar and Seton Lloyd between 1946 and 1949 revealed 18 successive levels of temple construction at Eridu, the deepest of which has been radiocarbon dated to approximately 5,400 BCE. That makes it one of the oldest known permanent settlements on Earth, contemporary with the earliest known villages at Catalhoyk in Anatolia and predating the first Egyptian settlements along the Nile by centuries. The king list says kingship started here. The archaeology confirms that settlement started here. The correlation is exact. It is not approximate. It is not suggestive. The oldest city in the king list is the oldest city in the archaeological record. Bad-tibira, modern Tel al-Madine in the Dikar Governorate, has been partially excavated. Fewer resources have been committed to it than to the major sites like Ur or Uruk, largely because Iraq's political instability in the late 20th century curtailed fieldwork at many smaller sites. But what has been found is consistent with a center of metalworking and craft production. The Sumerian name itself, Bad-tibira, translates in standard Sumerian lexicography as fortress of the metalsmiths or wall of the copperworkers. The word tibira means metalworker or coppersmith. This is not a speculative etymology. It is not an alternative reading. It is confirmed by Samuel Noah Kramer in his published glossaries, by the Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary, and by every standard reference work on Sumerian vocabulary. A city named for metalworking, listed second in the king list, immediately after the initial settlement. The text places metallurgy second in the sequence of civilizational development, and the archaeology, limited as it is, has produced Ubaid period pottery consistent with early occupation and a surface scatter that does not contradict the metalworking association. Sippar, or modern Tel Abu Haba, is the 4th city in the antediluvian sequence and one of the best documented archaeological sites in all of Mesopotamia. Hormuzd Rassam, the Assyrian-born archaeologist who had previously worked alongside Henry Layard at the excavation of Nineveh and who later discovered the Cyrus cylinder, excavated Sippar in the 1870s and 1880s under the auspices of the British Museum. What Rassam found was staggering in volume. A temple archive of tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets, many of them astronomical observations, mathematical calculations involving planetary positions, eclipse prediction tables, and ritual calendars tied to celestial events. Sippar was the cult center of Shamash, the Mesopotamian sun deity, and its temple, the Babar, meaning the shining house, was one of the most important astronomical institutions in the ancient world. The king list places Sippar fourth. Sippar's archaeology confirms that this city functioned as an observatory. The correlation holds. Shuruppak, Tel Farah, is the 5th and final antediluvian city. It is the flood city. The last king named before the flood, Ubara Tutu, ruled from Shuruppak. His son, or in some versions, his counselor, is Ziusudra, the Sumerian flood hero, known in the Akkadian tradition as Atrahasis, and later as Utnapishtim in the Gilgamesh epic. Excavations by Robert Koldewey and later by Eric Schmidt in the early 20th century revealed a flood deposit at Shuruppak, a sterile layer of water-laid sediment separating earlier and later occupation levels. The king list places the flood city last. The archaeology confirms a flood event at that site. 5 cities, 5 functions, 5 archaeological confirmations of those functions. This is the pattern the conventional reading has never explained. What Sitchin pointed out, and what has not been addressed systematically in any mainstream Assyriological publication, is that the sequence is not random and is not political. It describes a functional progression. First, a settlement beside freshwater springs in the most fertile location available. Then, a metalworking facility for processing raw materials. Then, a territorial administration node for managing the growing network. Then, an astronomical observatory for monitoring celestial phenomena. Then, a staging ground for the catastrophic event the entire Sumerian literary tradition says is coming: the deluge. Sitchin argued this was not mythology retrojected onto geography. It was infrastructure described in the order it was built by the entities that built it, and the reign lengths, those impossible numbers, were not metaphors for prestige. They were not symbolic expressions of theological duration. They were administrative rotations measured in sars, each sar representing 3,600 years. The Sumerian mathematical system was sexagesimal, base 60. This is well established. The sar is 60 times 60, 3,600. Sitchin proposed that each sar corresponded to one orbital period of what he called the 12th planet, Nibiru, and that the Anunnaki rulers stationed on Earth rotated their administrative duties on that cycle. The proposal is extraordinary, but the mathematics are verifiable. Alulim, the first ruler at Eridu, served for 8 sars, 28,800 years. Alogar, the second ruler at Eridu, served for 10 sars, 36,000 years. Enmen-Luana, the first ruler at Bad-tibira, served for 12 sars, 43,200 years. Enmen-Gal-Ana served for 28,800 years, 8 sars. The divine Dumuzi, also at Bad-tibira, served for 36,000 years, 10 sars. Ensippad-Zid-Ana at Larak served for 28,800 years, 8 sars. Enmen-Dur-Ana at Sippar served for 21,000 years, which breaks the clean sar pattern slightly, at 5 sars and 5 nirs, where 1 nir equals 600. Ubara-Tutu at Shuruppak served for 18,600 years, 5 sars and 1 nir. The numbers are precise. They are internally consistent. They follow a mathematical structure rooted in the sexagesimal system that is not arbitrary. It uses the same base 60 units that the Sumerians used for everything from land measurement to celestial calculation. The total of all antediluvian reigns, 241,200 years, equals 67 sars. And the question that mainstream Assyriology has never published a formal answer to is this: if the numbers are purely symbolic, why are they mathematically structured in base 60? Why do they produce clean sar and nir multiples? Why does each individual reign resolve to a whole number count of standard Sumerian mathematical units? And why are these mathematically precise durations attached to real cities whose archaeological profiles match the functions the text implies? No peer-reviewed paper has addressed this set of questions together. The mathematical structure has been acknowledged. The geographical reality of the cities has been acknowledged. But the correspondence between the two, the fact that precise mathematical durations are assigned to functionally specialized real cities listed in a specific operational order, has never been the subject of a published academic analysis. The implications of this reading extend well beyond the Sumerian king list itself. If the 5 antediluvian cities were operational centers built by the Anunnaki, and if the rulers named in the king list were not mythological figures, but administrators serving defined rotations measured in sars, then the transition described in the text after the flood takes on a different character entirely. The king list records that after the flood, kingship descended from heaven a second time, this time to the city of Kish, but this time the reign lengths collapse. The first post-Diluvian dynasty at Kish includes rulers who reigned for over 1,000 years, still impossibly long by modern biological standards, but an order of magnitude shorter than the antediluvian figures. The next generation reigns for hundreds of years. Within a few dynasties, the numbers converge on biologically plausible human lifespans: 40 years, 30 years, 25 years. The durations shrink toward human scale in a pattern that is mathematically smooth, not erratic. It is not a sudden break from mythological to historical. It is a gradient, a taper, a controlled descent from one scale of administration to another. In the conventional reading, this taper reflects the scribes gradually shifting from mythological time to historical time, a literary transition from sacred to secular. The early post-flood dynasties, according to this interpretation, still carry the residue of mythological exaggeration. The later dynasties record actual reign lengths that can be correlated with other historical sources. The taper is a feature of literary composition, not historical memory. But in Sitchin's reading, the taper reflects something else entirely. The Anunnaki withdrawing from direct governance and delegating authority to human or hybrid intermediaries whose lifespans were, by definition, shorter. The first generation of post-flood rulers still served long tenures because they were still, in this framework, Anunnaki administrators or their direct appointees. As the delegating entities withdrew further, returning in Sitchin's model to Nibiru at the end of their orbital cycles, the administrative continuity fractured. Human governors replaced divine ones. Lifespans shortened because the administrators were now biologically human, and the reign lengths in the king list track this transition with the same mathematical precision that characterized the antediluvian section. The numbers are not random. They describe a process. The Sumerian term for these early post-flood rulers is revealing. The title En.si, one of the most common titles in Sumerian administrative texts, is often translated as lord or governor. But the etymology is more specific. En means lord or master. Si has been parsed in various ways, but one standard reading renders the compound as lord of the productive land, a governor whose authority is defined by the territory he administers, not by his own inherent sovereignty. In some texts, the En.si is explicitly a subordinate figure. He governs on behalf of a higher authority. He is appointed, not self-made. The Akkadian cognate Isaku carries a similar connotation, a governor who rules not by independent sovereignty, but by delegation from above. The En.si is not a king in the modern sense. He is an appointed manager of a defined territory, answerable to whatever authority placed him there. These En.si figures governed real cities. They managed real irrigation networks, the complex system of canals, levees, and water distribution channels that made agriculture possible in the semi-arid alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia. They oversaw real grain stores, real labor forces, real canal maintenance schedules, real land tenure registers. They appear in administrative texts alongside the most mundane records imaginable. Inventories of barley distribution, tallies of sheep and goats, ledgers of silver payments, records of land sales and inheritances. There is nothing mythological about the administrative archive of a city governed by an En.si. The records are practical, specific, and verifiable. They describe a functioning city-state with a complex economy, a stratified labor force, and a bureaucracy sophisticated enough to track individual transactions across years and sometimes decades. But the textual tradition surrounding these same En.si figures insists repeatedly across multiple genres of Sumerian literature, from royal hymns to temple dedications to mythological narratives, that their authority derived from beings who were not human. The authority came from above. It was delegated. It was conditional. The En.si did not rule because he was the strongest warrior or the wealthiest landowner. He ruled because the gods had placed him there. And the gods in Sumerian literature are not abstract spiritual entities. They are the Anunnaki, named, described with specific personalities, specific responsibilities, specific temples, and specific relationships to the cities they patronized. Enki was the patron of Eridu. Inanna was the patron of Uruk. Enlil was the patron of Nippur. Nanna was the patron of Ur. Each major city had its divine patron, and the En.si of that city governed as the patron deity's human agent. In the conventional reading, this is theology expressed through political structures. In the alternative reading, it is a memory of actual delegation, actual non-human authorities, placing actual human administrators in charge of actual cities. The disguise was not a disguise at all. It was the human face of an administration whose ultimate authorities had withdrawn beyond direct visibility. The Atrahasis epic, preserved on tablets in the British Museum and dating in its old Babylonian version to approximately 1700 BCE, provides the narrative context for this entire transition. The text describes the Anunnaki assembling in council and dividing the cosmos among themselves, Anu taking the heavens, Enlil taking the earth, and Enki taking the subterranean waters. The Agia, a lower class of divine beings in the Sumerian Akkadian pantheon, are assigned the physical labor of maintaining the earth, digging canals, dredging rivers, building irrigation infrastructure. The text is specific about the nature of this labor. It is not symbolic. It is agricultural engineering, the same canal digging and water management work that the En.Si governors would later oversee using human labor forces. The Igigi performed this work for 40 years, or in some readings of the damaged text, for a period described using the same SAR-based units as the king list. And then they rebel. They burn their tools. They surround Enlil's dwelling. They refuse to continue. The solution the Anunnaki devise is the creation of humanity, a new laboring class, fashioned from clay mixed with the blood and flesh of a slain god named Wee-Ilu, whose name some scholars read as containing the Akkadian word for intelligence or understanding. The creation is physical, specific, and procedural. The text describes the goddess Nintu, also called Mami or Belit Ili, mixing the clay, shaping it, and overseeing a gestation period that produces 7 male and 7 female humans. These beings, Lulu, mixed ones, are capable of performing the agricultural and canal maintenance labor the Igigi abandoned. They are capable of breeding, they are capable of sustaining themselves, and they are capable, crucially, of becoming numerous, which they do, to the point where their noise disturbs Enlil and precipitates the eventual flood decision. What the Atrahasis describes in Sitchin's framework is not a creation myth in the theological sense, not an explanation of why humans exist in the cosmic order. It is a labor substitution event. The Anunnaki needed workers. The Igigi would not comply. Humans were engineered as replacements, and the cities the Anunnaki had built, Eridu, Bad-tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, were then gradually handed over to these engineered workers. The handover was not instantaneous. The king list's mathematical structure describes it as a graduated process. Divine rulers serving SAR-length rotations were succeeded by hybrid En.Si governors whose lifespans were already shorter, who were in turn succeeded by fully human kings whose reigns lasted decades rather than millennia. That is the thesis embedded in the king list's mathematical structure, not that gods existed in some abstract theological sense, but that specific beings built specific cities, ruled them for specific durations, measured in specific units, and then, for reasons the text does not fully explain, stepped back and allowed humans to take over the administration of the infrastructure they had built. The transition was not clean, and the texts do not pretend it was. The post-flood sections of the King List and related texts describe a period of instability, rival cities competing for kingship, short-lived dynasties, military conflicts between city-states that had previously operated within a coordinated framework. The Sumerian literary tradition frames this as a period when the land was confused and kingship was scattered. In the conventional reading, this reflects the historical reality of the early dynastic period, approximately 2900 to 2300 BCE, a time of genuine political fragmentation documented in the archaeological record by destroyed city walls, mass graves, and rapidly changing ceramic styles that suggest disrupted trade networks. In the alternative reading, it reflects the predictable consequence of removing central coordination from a network of functionally specialized cities. Without the coordinating authority, whatever the Anunnaki represented, the cities that had operated as complementary nodes in a system began competing with one another as independent polities. Each city still had its en.si. Each en.si still claimed divine sanction, but the actual coordinating presence had withdrawn, and what remained were human administrators operating inherited infrastructure according to inherited procedures, competing for resources that had previously been allocated by a central authority that no longer answered. The Book of Enoch, preserved complete only in the Ge'ez language of the Ethiopian Orthodox canon, with fragmentary Aramaic versions found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran in the Judean desert, describes a strikingly parallel sequence that is worth examining here before we address the academic response. The Watchers, a class of divine beings, descend to a specific location, Mount Hermon, on the border of modern Lebanon and Syria, and establish themselves among human communities. They do not arrive invisibly. They do not arrive as abstract spiritual presences. They arrive as beings who interact physically with humans, who take human partners, and who teach specific functional knowledge that transforms the human communities around them. The text is remarkably specific about what they teach. Azazel teaches metalworking and weapon forging. Simjaza teaches enchantments and herbalism, pharmacology in a modern reading. Barakiel teaches the observation of star, astronomy. Arakiel teaches the reading of earthly signs, what we might call geomancy or terrestrial observation. Shamsiel teaches the signs of the sun, solar astronomy as distinct from stellar. Serial teaches the course of the moon, lunar calculation. The knowledge transfer is cataloged by the text, attached to named individuals with defined specializations. Each watcher has a portfolio. Each portfolio corresponds to a functional category that appears independently in the Sumerian descriptions of what the antediluvian cities did: metallurgy, astronomy, observation, agriculture. The watchers embed themselves in human communities, establish what amounts to governance through knowledge superiority, and produce hybrid offspring, the Nephilim, who are described as powerful, destructive, and ultimately unsustainable. The parallels with the Sumerian framework are structural, not superficial. Beings descend. They build or reorganize human settlements. They transfer specific functional knowledge. They produce hybrid intermediaries. And then they withdraw or are withdrawn. And the human communities they establish continue without them, carrying the knowledge forward but losing the understanding of where it came from. The academic response to Sitchin's reading of the antediluvian cities has followed a pattern that is by now familiar to anyone who has studied the reception of alternative approaches to ancient history. It was not refuted, it was dismissed. The distinction matters, and it matters precisely because it defines the intellectual boundary that this material occupies. Refutation requires engaging with specific claims. It requires demonstrating that the SAR-based calculation is mathematically flawed, or that the five cities do not in fact correspond to functional specializations, or that the post-flood rain length collapse has a more compelling explanation than graduated withdrawal, or that the correlation between city names and archaeological profiles is coincidental and can be shown to be so. Refutation, in other words, requires work. It requires a scholar to sit down with the text, with the mathematics, with the archaeological reports, and produce a counter-analysis of comparable specificity. Dismissal requires only a characterization, and characterization is what Sitchin received. Sitchin was called a pseudo-scholar. His work was categorized as ancient astronaut theory, a label that groups his specific textual and mathematical arguments with a broad category of claims, many of which he never made, and some of which he explicitly rejected. His books were shelved in the New Age section of bookshops, rather than in ancient history, a classification decision that functions as a social signal. Serious readers need not apply. His specific reading of the en.sei title, that it preserves evidence of appointed governance by a non-human authority and was never addressed in a peer-reviewed Assyriological journal. His specific interpretation of the SAR as a constant tied to an orbital period, an interpretation that, whatever its merits, is mathematically testable, was never tested in print by a mathematician or astronomer, publishing in a venue that Assyriologists read. His specific identification of the five antediluvian cities as a functional network, settlement, metallurgy, territorial administration, astronomical observation, flood preparation, was never the subject of a published counter-analysis, arguing that the sequence is random, or political, or otherwise explicable without reference to functional specialization. Michael Heiser, a scholar of ancient Semitic languages who earned his doctorate from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, published the most detailed critique of Sitchin's work. Heiser was trained in Hebrew, Aramaic, and related Northwest Semitic languages, with additional competence in Akkadian. He created a dedicated website examining Sitchin's translations, sign by sign, comparing Sitchin's readings of specific cuneiform passages against the standard lexical resources used by professional Assyriologists, the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, the Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary, and the Akkadisches Handwörterbuch. Heiser argued that Sitchin misread specific cuneiform signs, that he confused signs that share visual similarity but carry different phonetic values, a hazard of working with a script that has over 600 distinct signs, many of which are distinguished by the position or number of small wedge impressions. Heiser also showed that Sitchin sometimes selected one possible translation from a range of attested meanings and presented it as the only viable reading, when professional Assyriologists would recognize the semantic range and note alternative translations. In some cases, Heiser argued, Sitchin chose the most dramatic possible rendering of an ambiguous term, reading a word as rocket when the standard dictionaries give bright object or shining thing, for example, and built interpretive weight on that dramatic rendering in ways the original text does not support. That critique has merit. It has specific, verifiable merit in several identifiable places. Sitchin was not a trained cuneiformist. He did not hold an academic appointment in Assyriology or ancient Near Eastern languages. He learned Sumerian and Akkadian outside the formal academic pipeline, without the years of guided reading and peer correction that university training provides. He made errors of transliteration that specialists can identify, and some of his readings, particularly of compound terms and rare lexical items, chose the most provocative option, where more conservative readings were equally or more plausible on strictly philological grounds. These are real weaknesses. They are not trivial. A translation that starts from the wrong reading of a cuneiform sign can cascade into a chain of interpretive errors that compounds with each subsequent step. Heiser identified several such chains and demonstrated them with reference to the primary sources, but Heiser's critique, detailed as it was, focused almost entirely on Sitchin's linguistic method, on the individual cuneiform signs and their readings, on specific translation choices, on the philological accuracy of particular passages. It did not address the structural argument. It did not engage with the question of why the king list names those five cities in that order. It did not analyze the SAR-based mathematical structure of the reign lengths and propose an alternative explanation for their precision. It did not address the correlation between the cities' names and their archaeological profiles. The fact that the city called Fortress of the Metalsmiths is listed in the Metallurgy position, the fact that the city with the largest astronomical archive is listed in the observation position, the fact that the city with the flood deposit is listed last. It did not propose an alternative explanation for why the antediluvian section of the king list preserves what appears to be a functional infrastructure sequence attached to real cities that match those functions. The critique was philological. The unanswered question is structural, and the gap between the two has never been closed by Heiser or by anyone else. The broader pattern of academic non-engagement extends well beyond Heiser's website. The Journal of Near Eastern Studies, published by the University of Chicago and widely considered the leading American journal in the field, has never published a paper that systematically addresses the mathematical structure of the antediluvian reign lengths. The Journal of Cuneiform Studies has published extensive work on the Sumerian king list, over the decade, its textual variants, its scribal transmission history, its relationship to other chronographic texts, its political function within the Isin Larsa period, but has not published a paper analyzing the specific SAR-based values assigned to each ruler and each city, and asking whether those values encode information beyond symbolic prestige. The Cambridge Ancient History, the standard multi-volume reference work used in virtually every university library in the English-speaking world, devotes several substantial pages to the Sumerian king list as a historical source for the early dynastic period, but treats the antediluvian section in a single paragraph that characterizes it as mythological, and moves on to the post-flood dynasties where correlation with other records is possible. The pattern is consistent across decades and across institutional boundaries. The antediluvian section is acknowledged as existing. It is described as mythological. Its mathematical structure is occasionally noted in passing. Daly noted it, Jacobson noted it, but is never made the subject of sustained analysis. And the specific features that would require explanation if the text were being taken seriously as evidence of anything other than mythology. The functional sequence, the SAR-based arithmetic, the geographical correspondence with real sites are passed over without analysis. This is not a conspiracy of silence. It would be unfair and inaccurate to describe it as one. It is the normal functioning of academic specialization and professional incentive structures. Assyriologists study the historical sections of the king list because those sections can be correlated with other historical records, royal inscriptions, year names, administrative archives, and because such correlations produce publishable scholarship that advances careers. The antediluvian section cannot be correlated with anything in the accepted historical framework, so it is classified as prehistorical, meaning, in practice, that no one is professionally rewarded for studying it in depth. A junior Assyriologist who proposed to write a dissertation on the mathematical structure of the antediluvian reign lengths would likely be counseled by their advisor to choose a more productive topic. The result is not a refutation. It is an absence. The question has not been answered because the question has not been formally asked, not in the venues where answers carry institutional weight, not in the journals where the field standards are set and enforced. And the question itself is straightforward enough to state in a single paragraph. 5 cities are named in a specific order. Each city is assigned a reign duration that resolves to a whole number count of standard Sumerian mathematical units. The 5 cities are real. They have been located and, in most cases, excavated. Their archaeological profiles correspond to the functional roles the text implies through naming, through patronage associations, and through recovered material culture. The question is whether this correspondence is coincidental, a lucky alignment between a political fiction and geographical reality, or whether the scribes who wrote the king list were preserving a memory of something they could describe but no longer fully understood. No peer-reviewed paper has demonstrated that the correspondence is coincidental. No peer-reviewed paper has demonstrated that it is meaningful. The question is open. Refutation requires engaging with specific claims, and the specific claims have not been engaged with. The 5 antediluvian cities do not exist in isolation. They sit within a broader Mesopotamian landscape that the cuneiform record describes with extraordinary specificity. A landscape of canals, irrigation systems, temple complexes, seasonal agricultural rhythms, and administrative hierarchies so detailed that modern archaeologists have been able to reconstruct individual field boundaries, individual tax assessments, and individual labor assignments from tablets that have survived in the earth for more than 4,000 years. To understand why the antediluvian city sequence matters, why it is not merely an academic curiosity, but a question with implications for how we understand the origins of civilization itself. It is necessary to understand the world those cities occupied, the world they imply, and the world that came after them. Eridu, the first city of kingship according to the king list, was excavated between 1946 and 1949 by the Iraqi Department of Antiquities under the direction of Fuad Sippar, with Seton Lloyd serving as architectural consultant and survey supervisor. The circumstances of the excavation were significant. Iraq had gained full independence from British Mandate authority in 1932, and by the mid 1940s, the Iraqi Department of Antiquities was asserting its capacity to conduct major archaeological projects with Iraqi leadership rather than under European direction. Sippar's excavation of Eridu was both a scientific project and a statement of national archaeological capability, and what his team found justified the ambition. The temple sequence at Eridu comprises 18 successive levels, one built directly on top of another, stretching from the Ubed period, approximately 5400 BCE, through the early dynastic period, roughly 2700 BCE. The deepest level, designated Temple 17 by the excavators, was a small sand brick shrine, barely more than a single room, measuring approximately 3.5 meters on a side, with a niche for an offering and traces of ash that suggest ritual burning. There was no monumental architecture. There was no city wall. There was a shrine, a spring, and the surrounding marshland of what was then the northern edge of the Persian Gulf. By the time the temple sequence reached its uppermost levels, Temple 1, the structure had become monumental: buttressed walls, multiple chambers, formal courtyards, and a raised platform that prefigured the ziggurats of later Sumerian architecture, the stepped temple towers that would become the defining architectural form of Mesopotamian civilization. The continuity is unbroken. For more than 2,500 years, the people of Eridu rebuilt their temple on the same spot. Each iteration was larger. Each was more elaborate. Each was built directly on the rubble and foundation of its predecessor, as if the location itself, not the building, but the ground, carried an authority that the structures merely expressed. No other site in Mesopotamia shows this degree of architectural continuity at a single sacred location. Ur has its ziggurat rebuilt by Ur-Nammu around 2100 BCE, but the earlier temple history at Ur is less complete. Uruk has its sequence of monumental temples in the Iana precinct, but these show more variation in orientation and plan than Eridu's relentless vertical accumulation. Nippur's Ekur temple has a long history, but with significant gaps and rebuildings that break the continuity. Eridu stands alone in the archaeological record as a place where the same sacred spot was venerated, rebuilt, and expanded continuously for over 2.5 millennia. The Sumerian literary tradition preserves a memory of this priority. In the text known as the Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest Sumerian compositions, surviving in fragmentary form on a tablet now at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, Eridu is named as the first city, the place where civilization began, the place where the gods first established contact with the human world. The literary tradition names Eridu as the home of Enki, the god of water, wisdom, craftsmanship, magic, and the subterranean freshwater ocean the Sumerians called the Abzu. Enki is one of the most complex deities in the Sumerian pantheon. He is associated with intelligence, ingenuity, and problem solving. He is the deity who devises the creation of humanity in the Atrahasas. He is the deity who warns Yosudra of the flood through the reed wall. He is the deity who, in the mythological text known as Inkai and the world order, assigns specific functions to specific cities and specific deities, an act of cosmic administration that mirrors, at the divine level, exactly the kind of functional city assignment that the antediluvian section of the king list describes. Enki's temple at Eridu was called the Abzu, House of the Deep Waters, is a Pozors, and the archaeological evidence is consistent with this naming in a way that goes beyond literary coincidence. Eridu sits near what was, in the 6th millennium BCE, the shoreline of the Persian Gulf. Its earliest levels show evidence of freshwater springs emerging from underground aquifers, the Abzu made physical. The surrounding marshland would have made the site uniquely fertile, a pocket of reliable water and vegetation in a landscape that was becoming increasingly arid as the climate shifted in the millennia after the last ice age. The fish bones recovered from the earliest temple levels, offerings left at the shrine, suggest a community oriented toward the water, dependent on the springs, and ritually connected to the aquatic environment in a way that the Inca mythology directly reflects. This is not mythology mapped onto geography after the fact. The geography came first. The springs were there before anyone named them. The settlement was there before anyone wrote a text about it. The literary tradition that names Enki as the founder and Eridu as the first city is, at minimum, preserving a memory of genuine priority, that this place was first, and that whoever or whatever established it chose the location for reasons that the physical environment itself confirms. Bad-tibira is less well excavated, but no less significant for the structural argument. The site, Tel al-Madine, in the Dikar Governorate of southeastern Iraq, was surveyed in the 1960s by Iraqi and international teams, but has never received the sustained multi-season excavation campaigns that Eridu, or Uruk have benefited from. The reasons are partly political: the instability of southern Iraq through the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, the Gulf War of 1991, and the subsequent decades of conflict curtailed archaeological fieldwork across the region, and partly a matter of priorities. Larger, more famous sites attract more funding and more academic attention. Bad-tibira, despite its significance in the textual record, has remained a secondary site in the archaeological hierarchy. What is known is that the surface scatter at Tel al-Madine includes Ubaid period pottery, confirming occupation contemporary with early Eridu, and that the site's ancient name is consistently associated with metalworking across every Sumerian text in which it appears. The word tabira is one of the most stable and unambiguous terms in the Sumerian lexicon. It means metalworker, coppersmith, or by extension, craftsman who works with metal. The compound Bad-tibira has been rendered by different scholars as fortress of the metalsmiths, wall of the copperworkers, or enclosure of the metalworkers. The variation is in the first element. Bad can mean wall, fortress, or enclosure, but the second element is not in dispute. This is a city defined by its association with metalworking. A city named for metalworking, listed second in the king list, immediately after the initial settlement beside freshwater springs. The text places metallurgy second in the sequence of civilizational development. If someone were describing the order in which they had built an operational infrastructure in a river valley, first establish the base camp at the water source, then build the facility for extracting and processing raw material, the sequence would look exactly like this. Larak, the third city, is the most obscure of the five and the one that has generated the most scholarly debate regarding its location. Tel al-Wilaya in southern Iraq has been proposed as the most likely candidate based on a combination of surface finds, textual references, and geographic reasoning about the spacing of major Sumerian sites in the alluvial plain. But the identification is not certain, and some scholars have proposed alternative locations. The king list assigns Larak a single ruler, En-Sipad-Zid Ana, who reigned for 28,800 years, or 8 Sars. Larak appears in Sumerian literary texts as a city under the patronage of the deity Pabalsag, a figure associated with boundary marking, land measurement, and territorial oversight. Pabalsag is sometimes described as a hunter or a warrior, but his core function in the texts that mention Larak is administrative. He defines boundaries, he establishes limits, he oversees the proper allocation of land and resources. If the antediluvian cities were functional stations in a coordinated network, Larak's role under Pabalsag's patronage would be administrative, the node that managed the allocation of territory and resources between the productive centers. The name in Sipad Zidana itself contains the element Sipad, meaning shepherd, not in the pastoral sense of one who tends flocks, but in the Sumerian administrative sense of one who oversees and manages a designated territory and its inhabitants. This is the same semantic field that later Sumerian kings drew on when they styled themselves shepherds of the people, a title that connoted not pastoral care in the emotional sense, but administrative oversight in the bureaucratic sense. Sippar, Tel Abu Haba, located approximately 35 kilometers southwest of modern Baghdad, is the fourth antediluvian city and among the richest archaeological sites in all of Mesopotamia in terms of recovered textual material. Hormuzd Rassam, who had previously worked alongside Henry Layard during the famous excavations at Nineveh in the 1840s and 1850s, conducted his own extensive campaigns at Sippar in the 1870s and 1880s under the authority and funding of the British Museum. Rassam was a remarkable figure. Born in Mosul to a Chaldean Christian family, educated in England through Layard's patronage, and eventually responsible for some of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 19th century, including the Cyrus Cylinder and the Bronze Gates of Balawat. At Sippar, what Rassam found was a temple archive of extraordinary volume. Tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets emerged from the Babar complex, the shining house dedicated to Shamash, the Mesopotamian deity of the sun, of justice, and of truth. Among these tablets were astronomical observation records spanning centuries, systematic logs of planetary positions, rising and setting times of stars, eclipse observations with dates and durations, and mathematical procedures for predicting future celestial events based on past observations. There were also mathematical texts. Calculations involved infractions, reciprocals, and the sexagesimal place value system that the Sumerians had invented, and the Babylonians refined into the most sophisticated mathematical notation in the ancient world. There were ritual calendars that synchronized temple activities with celestial events, the heliacal rising of specific stars, the first visibility of the new moon, solstices, equinoxes. Sippar was not a settlement that happened to look at the sky. It was an institution designed for the systematic observation, recording, and prediction of celestial phenomena. The astronomical records from Sippar and its associated scribal traditions form the foundation of what modern historians of science call Babylonian mathematical astronomy. The systematic approach to celestial prediction that produced, among other things, accurate models of the moon's motion, reliable eclipse prediction cycles, and planetary period relations that later Greek astronomers, including Hipparchus of Nicaea in the 2nd century BCE and Ptolemy in the 2nd century CE, are documented as having incorporated into their own work. The Greek debt to Babylonian astronomy is not speculative. It is attested in the ancient sources themselves. Hipparchus is known to have had access to Babylonian eclipse records through intermediaries, and his lunar theory shows direct dependence on Babylonian parameters. The Babar temple at Sippar was rebuilt multiple times across Mesopotamian history by Hammurabi in the 18th century BCE, by Nebuchadnezzar in the 6th century BCE, and by Nabonidus, the last native king of Babylon, who was famous for his antiquarian interest in restoring ancient temples to their original plans. Each rebuilding is attested in foundation inscriptions that name the king responsible and the deity honored. The continuity of astronomical function at this single site spans more than 2,000 years of documented activity, and the oral traditions associated with the site suggest that the astronomical traditions predated even the earliest written records recovered from it. The king list places Sippar fourth, after settlement, after metallurgy, after territorial administration. The observatory comes fourth in the sequence. The sequence has an internal logic. You observe the sky after you have secured your water, your materials, your territorial organization, that the conventional reading has never proposed an explanation for. Shuruppak, Tel Farah, located in the Sadizaya governorate of central southern Iraq, closes the antediluvian sequence. It is the flood city. The last antediluvian king, Ubara Tutu, ruled from Shuruppak for 18,600 years, 5 Sars and 1 Nir in the sexagesimal notation. His son or advisor Ziusudra is the Sumerian flood hero. The name Ziusudra itself means life of long days, an epithet that, in the context of the king list's mathematics, reads less like a mythological honorific and more like a description of a figure who bridged the transition between the long-lived antediluvian administrators and the shorter-lived post-flood rulers. In the Akkadian version of the tradition, the Atrahasis epic, the flood hero is called Atrahasis, exceedingly wise. In the standard Babylonian Gilgamesh epic, the version that Gilgamesh encounters in Tablet 11, the famous flood narrative tablet recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, the flood hero is called Utnapishtim, he found life. And in the Hebrew tradition, transmitted through Genesis chapters 6 through 9, the flood hero is Noah, from a root meaning rest or comfort. Four independent names and four independent linguistic traditions, all describing the same narrative figure, the survivor of a catastrophic flood who bridges the world before and the world after. The Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest surviving Sumerian literary compositions, described Ziusudra receiving a direct warning from Enki that the assembly of the god, the Anunnaki, has decreed a flood to destroy humanity. Enki speaks to Ziusudra not face to face, but through a reed wall, a detail that appears identically in the Atrahasis epic, where Enki addresses Atrahasis through the same device, and in the Gilgamesh flood narrative on Tablet 11. The reed wall device is a legal stratagem. Enki had taken an oath with the other Anunnaki not to warn any human of the coming flood. By speaking to the wall rather than to Ziusudra directly, he preserved the letter of the oath while violating its spirit, a reading that suggests the Anunnaki operated under formal agreements with binding institutional force, not merely as capricious deities making ad hoc decisions. The oath structure implies governance, it implies rules, it implies a system of collective decision-making with enforcement mechanisms strong enough that even a senior deity like Enki could not simply ignore them, but had to find a legal workaround. Shuruppak's archaeology supports its role in the flood tradition. Excavations by Robert Coldaway, followed by Eric Schmidt's University of Pennsylvania expedition in 1931, and later by Harriet Martin's campaign in the 1970s, revealed a flood deposit at the site, a sterile layer of alluvial sediment, water-laid clay and silt, separating earlier Jemdet Nasr period and early dynastic occupation levels. This deposit has been dated to approximately 2900 BCE. Below it, occupation. Above it, occupation. In between, a layer of clean sediment deposited by water, a physical boundary between one world and the next. Whether this specific event corresponds to the flood of the Sumerian literary tradition or to one of many periodic inundations in the low-lying alluvial plain of southern Iraq remains a subject of archaeological debate. Leonard Woolley found a similar flood deposit at Ur, several meters thick, which he famously and perhaps prematurely identified as evidence of the biblical flood. Other sites in southern Mesopotamia show comparable deposits at different stratigraphic levels, suggesting that major flooding events were recurrent in the region. But the point is not whether Shuruppak's flood deposit is the flood. The point is that the textual tradition places the flood at Shuruppak specifically, not at Ur, not at Uruk, not at Nippur, and the archaeology at Shuruppak specifically confirms a major flood event at the relevant stratigraphic horizon. The King list places Shuruppak last in the antediluvian sequence, the final city before the catastrophe. If the 5 cities were built as a coordinated infrastructure, Shuruppak was the end station, not the most important city, not the most prestigious, the last one, the one where the knowledge of what was coming had already arrived, and where preparations, whatever form they took, could be made. Settlement, metallurgy, territorial administration, astronomical observation, flood preparation, 5 functions, 5 cities, 5 confirmations. The reading is available to anyone who places the text next to a map of the excavated sites and allows the correlation to register. The Yoruba Ifa divination corpus, one of the oldest continuously practiced oral knowledge systems in West Africa, maintained by a specialized priesthood called the Babalawo, and transmitted through an apprenticeship system that requires years of memorization and ritual training, preserves a tradition that is structurally parallel to the Sumerian antediluvian city sequence in ways that deserve careful attention. The Orisha, divine beings in the Yoruba cosmological tradition, descended to Ile-Ife, the sacred city in what is now Osun State, southwestern Nigeria. They did not arrive as abstract theological presences. They did not arrive as metaphors. They arrived as founders, physical beings who interacted with the material world, who shaped the landscape, who established institutions, and who eventually receded from direct involvement in human affairs. Oduduwa, the Orisha credited with establishing Ile-Ife, is described in the oral tradition as descending from the sky, or in some versions, from an upper world called Orin, carrying specific materials, a handful of earth, a five-toed cockerel, and a palm nut. He spread the earth on the primordial waters, creating dry land. The cockerel scattered the earth with its feet, extending the terrain outward from the point of descent, and Oduduwa established the first city, Ile-Ife, whose name translates as House of Expansion or Place of Origin, on the land he had made. Other Orisha followed. Ogun brought metalworking, specifically iron smelting and blacksmithing, technologies that transformed the material culture of the region. Ozanyan brought herbalism and medicine. Orunmila brought the Ifa divination system itself, a binary mathematical system of extraordinary sophistication based on 256 possible combinations of 16 primary figures used for decision-making, medical diagnosis, conflict resolution, and cosmological inquiry. The knowledge transfer was not vague. It was specific, cataloged, and attributed to named divine beings with defined specializations. Ile-Ife is a real place. It has been excavated. Archaeological work conducted by Frank Willett of the University of Glasgow, beginning in the 1950s, and continued by later researchers, including Ekpo Ayo of the Nigerian Department of Antiquities, revealed a sophisticated urban civilization that flourished centuries before European contact. The Ife bronze and terracotta heads, naturalistic portrait sculptures of extraordinary technical refinement, depicting rulers and ritual figures with a realism that astonished European scholars when they were first published, have been dated to approximately the 12th through 15th centuries CE. The metalworking techniques used to produce these sculptures, lost wax casting in bronze and brass alloys, represent some of the most advanced metallurgical work in pre-colonial sub-Saharan Africa. The oral tradition says the Orisha who founded Ile-Ife brought specific functional knowledge: metalworking, agriculture, divination, governance, medicine. The archaeology confirms that Ile-Ife was a major center of exactly these activities, a place where sophisticated metallurgy, complex governance structures, and an elaborate ritual system all converged. The structural parallel with the Sumerian tradition is precise. A divine founder descends. The first city is established at a specific location chosen for specific reasons. Functional knowledge is transferred in defined categories: metallurgy, agriculture, astronomical and divinatory arts, administrative governance, medicine. The founding entities interact with humans, establish hybrid governance structures, and then, over time, withdraw or recede from direct participation in human affairs. Human administrators continue the work. The knowledge persists. The source is remembered in texts and oral traditions that later scholars classify as mythology. The Popol Vuh, the creation narrative of the Quiche Maya of Highland. Guatemala describes a parallel architecture from a wholly independent cultural tradition, separated from both Sumer and West Africa by thousands of kilometers of ocean. The Popol Vuh was written down in the Latin alphabet in the mid-16th century CE by Quiche nobles, who had learned Spanish literacy from Franciscan missionaries, but the oral tradition it preserves is far older, a pre-Columbian narrative that the Quiche themselves regarded as the foundational account of their origins and their relationship to the divine, the gods, Tepu and Guchemats, whose names translate roughly as sovereign and feathered serpent, create humans through a series of attempts, each of which reveals something about the relationship between creators and created. The first humans are made of mud. They dissolve, they cannot hold their shape, they cannot speak, they cannot worship. The gods destroy them. The second humans are made of wood. They walk and talk, they multiply, they populate the earth, but they have no understanding. They do not remember their creators. They do not honor the gods who made them. And so the gods send a flood, a great inundation that destroys the wooden people, aided by animals and even by the wooden people's own cooking implements, which rise up against them. The third attempt, the successful creation is fashioned from maize dough, the sacred substance of Mesoamerican civilization. These humans can see everything. They perceive across distances, through solid mountains to the edges of the cosmos. Their vision is unlimited. Their understanding is complete, and this capability alarms the gods. The Popol Vuh states explicitly, and this is one of the most significant passages in the text, that the gods deliberately limited the perception of these humans. The heart of sky breathed mist into their eyes, the text says, and they were blinded as the face of a mirror is breathed upon. Their vision was narrowed. Their perception was reduced to what was directly in front of them. Their cosmic awareness was taken away. And only then, after the limitation, did the gods provide these diminished humans with wives. And from these unions descended the Quiche lineages. The parallel with the Mesopotamian tradition is structural, not superficial, and it operates at multiple levels simultaneously. In the Atrahasis, the Anunnaki create humans to perform agricultural labor that the Agigi refused. And later, when the human population grows too large and too noisy, the Anunnaki decide to destroy them with a flood. In the Popol Vuh, the gods create beings who are too limited and destroy them with a flood, and then create beings who are too capable and deliberately diminish them. In both cases, the relationship between creator and created is characterized by calibration, the creators adjusting the capabilities of their creations to match a desired specification. In both cases, a flood marks a transition point between one version of humanity and the next. In both cases, the creators build civilizational infrastructure, cities, agricultural systems, governance structures, and delegate its operation to humans. And in both cases, the creators eventually withdraw from direct involvement, leaving behind a world that remembers them in sacred texts and oral traditions. The Quiche Maya had no contact with Sumer. The Popol Vuh was composed in a highland Mesoamerican context with no known connection to Mesopotamian literary traditions. The Yoruba Ifa tradition developed independently on the West African coast. The Book of Enoch, preserved complete only in the Jazz language of the Ethiopian Orthodox canon, with fragmentary Aramaic versions found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, adds yet another independent data point from yet another cultural tradition. The Watchers descend to Mount Hermon. They teach metalworking, astronomy, pharmacology, and divination, each skill attached to a named individual with a defined specialization. They take human partners. They produce hybrid offspring. A flood destroys the hybrids, and the knowledge persists in human hands. The convergence of structural pattern, descent, city building, knowledge transfer, calibration of human capabilities, hybridization, flood withdrawal, human continuation with inherited knowledge across four independent traditions on three separate continents raises a question that neither coincidence nor diffusion theory can answer comfortably. The conventional academic explanation invokes shared psychological archetypes, the idea associated with Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell that all human cultures independently generate similar mythological structures because the human mind is wired to produce them. The flood is a universal symbol of purification. The divine teacher is a universal archetype of culture hero. The withdrawal of the gods is a universal expression of the human feeling that the world has become disenchanted. These are not unreasonable explanations. They have real explanatory power for the broad outlines of mythological similarity across cultures, but they do not explain the specificity. They do not explain why the knowledge transfer in the Book of Enoch is cataloged by named individual and defined specialization in a way that maps directly onto the functional specializations of the Sumerian antediluvian cities. They do not explain why the Popol Vuh describes a deliberate limitation of human perception that echoes the Atrahasis description of a deliberate calibration of human capabilities. They do not explain Why the Yoruba tradition describes a descent with specific materials, earth, cockerel, palm nut, that function as a settlement kit in exactly the way the Eridu settlement functioned as the first node in a network. The alternative reading is that the traditions preserve independent memories transmitted through different cultural systems, encoded in different languages, shaped by different literary conventions of the same category of event. Not identical memories, not carbon copies, but structural parallels too specific to be explained by universal archetypes alone. The strongest counter-argument to Sitchin's reading of the antediluvian cities comes from two directions, and both deserve serious treatment rather than the dismissal that alternative readings typically receive from mainstream commentary. The first is linguistic, and it has been articulated most thoroughly by Michael Heiser. Heiser argued that Sitchin's translations of key Sumerian terms, including his reading of the Sar as an orbital period tied to a planetary body, his interpretation of En.sy as Lord appointed by the gods in a literal rather than theological sense, and his rendering of various Sumerian compound terms as references to space travel and genetic engineering, are not supported by standard Sumerian and Akkadian lexicography as compiled in the major reference works of the field, the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, the Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary, and the Akkadisches Handwörterbuch, compiled by Wolfram von Soden. Heiser's critique is specific and in several places technically correct. Sitchin was self-taught in Sumerian and Akkadian. He did not hold a doctorate in ancient languages. He approached the text with a hypothesis already in hand, and that hypothesis sometimes led him to prefer readings that supported his framework over readings that were more philologically conservative, but less dramatic. This is a legitimate methodological objection. It constrains the confidence that can be placed in Sitchin's individual translation choices. The second counter-argument is archaeological, and it is in some ways more damaging to the literal version of Sitchin's thesis. The five antediluvian cities, while real, do not all show occupation levels dating to the extreme antiquity that Sitchin's Sar-based timeline would require. Eridu's earliest excavated levels date to approximately 5,400 BCE, genuinely ancient, among the oldest urban sites in the world, but not remotely close to the hundreds of thousands of years that a literal reading of the King List's antediluvian section would demand. Bad-tibira's surface scatter suggests Ubaid period occupation, roughly the same temporal horizon as early Eridu. Neither site has produced material evidence, stone tools, fire pits, modified bone, or any other indicator of human presence, dating to the periods implied by Sitchin's calculations. The archaeology supports the cities as ancient. It does not support them as ancient enough for a literal Sar-based chronology. These are genuine objections. They constrain Sitchin's interpretation in real and important ways. They mean that the literal version of his thesis, that the Anunnaki physically occupied these cities for hundreds of thousands of years as measured in Earth-time SARS, does not align with the material evidence currently available. But they do not resolve the structural question that sits underneath the literal claims. The linguistic critique shows that some of Sitchin's individual translations are unreliable. It does not explain why the King List names those five cities in that order. It does not explain the Sar-based mathematical structure. It does not explain the correspondence between city names and archaeological profiles. The archaeological critique shows that the cities are not hundreds of thousands of years old in their current excavated form. It does not explain why the text assigns them functionally specialized roles: settlement, metallurgy, territorial oversight, astronomical observation, flood preparation, that align with their independently confirmed archaeological identities. It does not explain why a political legitimation device, which is what the conventional reading says the King List is, would need to be this specific, this mathematically structured, and this geographically accurate. The debate remains genuinely unresolved. This is not a diplomatic way of saying that one side is right and the other is wrong. It is a statement of fact about the published literature. Sitchin's framework has known weaknesses in its philological method, in its literal chronology, in some of its more dramatic claims about space travel and genetic engineering that go well beyond what the text can reasonably be made to support. But the mainstream alternative that the antediluvian section is simply a political legitimation device with no recoverable historical content has its own unexplained residues. It has never accounted for the functional sequence. It has never accounted for the mathematical structure. It has never proposed a reason why five specific cities, in a specific order, with specific SAR-based durations, would be necessary components of a political fiction. The question is still open if the antediluvian cities of the Sumerian king list preserve a memory of actual infrastructure built by whoever or whatever the Sumerians understood as the Anunnaki, whether that term refers to extraterrestrial visitors, a lost pre-flood civilization, or some other category of advanced predecessor. Then several features of early Mesopotamian civilization require re-examination. The sudden appearance of complex urban organization in the Uruk period, the late 4th millennium BCE, roughly 3500 to 3100 BCE, has long been noted as anomalous by archaeologists who study the transition from village to city in southern Mesopotamia. The so-called Uruk expansion, in which the material culture and administrative practices of southern Mesopotamia spread rapidly across a vast area stretching from southeastern Turkey to southwestern Iran, has no clear gradualist explanation. The standardized pottery forms, the cylinder seals, the early writing system, and the monumental architecture all appear within a relatively compressed time frame, as if a complete urban toolkit was deployed rather than developed incrementally. The sexagesimal mathematics that appear in the earliest known scribal tablets, a base 60 system of extraordinary sophistication that gave us our 60-minute hour and our 360-degree circle, have no identified developmental predecessor in simpler counting systems. There is no known sequence of increasingly complex counting technologies leading up to the sexagesimal system. It appears in the record substantially complete. The astronomical knowledge embedded in cuneiform records from Sippar and from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh includes planetary period relations and eclipse cycles whose observational basis would require centuries of systematic, continuous record keeping. The known timeline of Mesopotamian literacy, beginning around 3300 BCE, barely accommodates the observational baseline that the astronomical parameters would require if they were derived from scratch. None of these anomalies prove that the Anunnaki built the five antediluvian cities. None of them prove that civilization in Mesopotamia was received rather than independently developed. But they are consistent with a tradition that preserves a memory of knowledge that was transmitted from a source the scribes could describe but not fully explain, a source they called the Anunnaki, who descended from heaven, who built cities, who administered those cities through long rotations, and who eventually withdrew, leaving behind an infrastructure and a knowledge base that human administrators inherited and maintained. The artifact is real. The cities are real. The mathematics are verifiable. The archaeological profiles correspond. And the question has not been answered. The Weld-Blundell prism is in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It has been there since the early 1920s, when it was catalogued after its recovery from Larsa by the Weld-Blundell expedition. The text it preserves is older. How much older, no one can say with certainty, because the textual tradition behind the king list predates the physical prism by centuries, possibly by millennia. The cities it names are real. Eridu has been excavated down to its earliest temple level, a small shrine on a sand dune beside a freshwater spring, dated to approximately 5400 BCE, built by people whose names we do not know, for reasons the archaeology can describe but not fully explain. Bad-tibira, the fortress of the metalsmiths, sits partially excavated in the Dikar governorate of southern Iraq, its deeper levels still untouched, its full story still unread. Larak, the third city, has not been definitively located, its administration lost in the alluvial plain, waiting for the survey that will identify it. Zipper's astronomical archives, recovered by Hormuzd Rassam in the 1870s and 1880s, are among the largest cuneiform collections ever brought to a single institution, and the astronomical knowledge they contain, planetary periods, eclipse predictions, mathematical procedures of startling precision, still informs the history of science. Shuruppak's flood deposit is real and measurable, a layer of sterile alluvial sediment, water-laid and lifeless, that separates one world from the next. Below it, the Jemdet Nazar period. Above it, the early dynastic period. In between, the boundary the Sumerians remembered as the event that ended the age of the gods and began the age of men. Zechariah Sitchin published his reading in 1976. He argued that the five antediluvian cities were built in sequence: settlement, metallurgy, administration, observation, preparation, by the beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki, that the impossibly long reigns recorded in the king list were administrative rotations measured in sars, 3,600 years each, rooted in the same sexagesimal mathematics the Sumerians used for everything else. That the transition to human kingship after the flood was not a literary device, but a record of withdrawal, a graduated transfer of authority from non-human administrators to human governors, tracked by the mathematically smooth decline in reign lengths that the king list records across the post-flood dynasties. His translations have been challenged. His chronology has been challenged. His more dramatic claims about planetary origins and genetic engineering have been challenged. But the structural question, why those five cities in that order, with those functions, with those mathematically precise durations, has not been answered. No mainstream Assyriologist has published a paper addressing the functional sequence. No mainstream journal has published an analysis of the SAR-based arithmetic. No counter-argument has explained why the antediluvian section would need to be this specific if it were purely a political fiction. The question was open when Stephen Langdon first translated the Prism in the 1920s. It was open when Jacobson published his critical edition in 1939. It was open when Sitchin proposed his reading in 1976. It is still open now.